Chapter 17 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 4. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 4 by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 17, Scott's Anaconda. Proclamations could call men into camp, money place weapons in their hands, and commissions authorize officers to lead them to battle. But where should they march, and when should they fight? For a time these questions furnished their own answer. The national capital must be defended, Baltimore opened to transit, and the Ohio line protected. The events of the first 2 weeks practically assured the achievement of these primary objects, and with the expansion of rebellion and the change from insurrection to civil war, such questions once more rose with imperative demand for solution. The young and ambitious commander of the Department of the Ohio was among the first to venture an opinion upon this complicated and far-reaching problem, doing so with more eagerness, perhaps because he, like everyone else, failed to comprehend the full proportions and significance of the coming struggle. On April 27, General McClellan wrote to the General-in-Chief, "The region north of the Ohio and between the Mississippi and the Alleghanies forms one grand strategic field, in which all operations must be under the control of one head, whether acting offensively or on the defensive. I assume it as the final result that hostilities will break out on the line of the Ohio. For 2 reasons it is necessary to delay this result by all political means for a certain period of time. First, to enable the Northwest to make the requisite preparations, now very incomplete. Second, that a strong diversion may be made in aid of the defense of Washington and the eastern line of operations. Premising, then, that a force of some 10,000 or 15,000 men should be stationed in suitable detachments along the Ohio line as an army of observation, he submitted 2 plans of campaign intended to produce results at least partially decisive. Could we be provided with arms, the Northwest has ample resources to furnish 80,000 men for active operations, after providing somewhat more than the troops mentioned above for the protection of the frontier. With the active army of operations, it is proposed to cross the Ohio at or in the vicinity of Gallipolis and move up the valley of the Great Kanawha on Richmond. In combination with this, Cumberland should be seized, and a few thousand men left at Ironton or Gallipolis to cover the rear and right flank of the main column. The presence of this detachment and a prompt movement on Louisville or the heights opposite Cincinnati would effectually prevent any interference on the part of Kentucky. The movement on Richmond should be conducted with the utmost promptness, and could not fail to relieve Washington as well as to secure the destruction of the Southern army if aided by a decided advance on the eastern line. Another plan would be, in the event of Kentucky assuming a hostile position, to cross the Ohio at Cincinnati or Louisville with 80,000 men, march straight on Nashville, and thence act according to circumstances. Were a battle gained before reaching Nashville so that the strength of Kentucky and Tennessee were effectually broken, a movement on Montgomery, aided by a vigorous movement on the eastern line towards Charleston and Augusta, should not be delayed. The ulterior movements of the combined armies might be on Pensacola, Mobile, and New Orleans. It seems clear that the forces of the Northwest should not remain quietly on the defensive, and that under present circumstances, if the supply of arms is such as to render it absolutely impossible to bring into the field the numbers indicated above, then offensive movements would be most effective on the line first indicated. But if so liberal a supply can be obtained as to enable us to dispose of 80,000 troops for the active army, then the second line of operations would be the most decisive. The astonishing crudeness of these plans is set in strong light by the few searching criticisms which General Scott endorsed upon the letter when he submitted it to the President. As at the date of this letter General McClellan knew nothing of the intended call for 2 years' volunteers, he must have had the idea of composing his enormous columns of 3 months' men for operating against Nashville and Richmond, that is, of men whose term of service would expire by the time he had collected and organized them. That such was his idea appears from a prior letter, in which, although the Ohio quota is but about 10,000 men, the general speaks, I think, of having 30,000 and wants arms, etc., for 80,000. 2. A march upon Richmond from the Ohio would probably ensure the revolt of Western Virginia, which, if left alone, will soon be 5 out of 7 for the Union. 3. The general eschews water transportation by the Ohio and Mississippi in favor of long, tedious, and breakdown of men, horses, and wagons marches. 4. His plan is to subdue the seceded states by piecemeal, instead of enveloping them all, nearly, at once by a cordon of posts on the Mississippi to its mouth from its junction with the Ohio, and by blockading ships of war on the seaboard. For the cordon, a number of men equal to one of the general's columns would probably suffice, and the transportation of men and all supplies by water is about a fifth of the land cost, besides the immense saving in time. General Scott did not stop at a mere revision of the suggestions which had been sent him. On the 3rd of May, and again on the 21st of the same month, he wrote to McClellan, outlining his own plans of campaign, so far as he had in the rapidly changing whirl of revolutionary events been able to reduce them to orderly examination and judgment, and asked his junior's advice in arranging details. The substance of them is here presented, not in their order of date, but in their logical connection. It is the design of the government to raise 25,000 additional regular troops and 60,000 volunteers for 3 years. It will be inexpedient either to rely on the 3 months' volunteers for extensive operations, or to put in their hands the best class of arms we have in store. The term of service would expire by the commencement of a regular campaign, and the arms not lost be returned, mostly in a damaged condition. Hence, I must strongly urge upon you to confine yourself strictly to the quota of 3 months' men called for by the War Department. We rely greatly on the sure operation of a complete blockade of the Atlantic and Gulf ports soon to commence. In connection with such blockade, we propose a powerful movement down the Mississippi to the ocean, with a cordon of posts at proper points and the capture of Forts Jackson and St. Philip, the object being to clear out and keep open this great line of communication in connection with the strict blockade of the seaboard, so as to envelop the insurgent states and bring them to terms with less bloodshed than by any other plan. I suppose there will be needed from 12 to 20 steam gunboats and a sufficient number of steam transports, say 40, to carry all the personnel, say 60,000 men, and materiel of the expedition, most of the gunboats to be in advance to open the way, and the remainder to follow and protect the rear of the expedition, etc. This army, in which it is not improbable you may be invited to take an important part, should be composed of our best regulars for the advance, and of 3 years' volunteers, all well officered, and with 4½ months of instruction in camps prior to, say, November 10. In the progress down the river, All the enemy's batteries on its banks we of course would turn and capture, leaving a sufficient number of posts with complete garrisons to keep the river open behind the expedition. Finally, it will be necessary that New Orleans should be strongly occupied and securely held until present difficulties are composed. I propose to organize an army of regulars and volunteers on the Ohio River of, say, 80,000 men, to be divided into two unequal columns, the smaller to proceed by water on the first autumnal swell in the rivers, headed and flanked by gunboats, propellers of great speed and strength, and the other column to proceed as nearly abreast as practicable by land, of course without the benefit of rail transportation, and receiving at certain points on the river its heavier articles of consumption from the freight boats of the first column. By this means the wagon train of the land column may no doubt be much diminished, but would still remain, I fear, so large as to constitute a great impediment to the movement. Would 80,000 men be sufficient to conquer its way to New Orleans and clear out the Mississippi to the Gulf? What should be the relative numbers of the two columns, and at how many points besides Louisville, Paducah, Columbus, Hickman, Memphis, Vicksburg, and New Orleans would the two columns be able to hold a close communication with each other? Of course, much would depend upon the relations to the United States of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Missouri. I ask your views not only on the foregoing points, but also as to the form, draft, tonnage, and armament of the gunboats or tugs. Cincinnati abounds in the best information on all these heads. A word now as to the greatest obstacle in the way of this plan, the great danger now pressing upon us, the impatience of our patriotic and loyal Union friends. They will urge instant and vigorous action regardless, I fear, of consequences. That is, unwilling to wait for the slow instruction of, say, 12 or 15 camps, for the rise of rivers and the return of frost to kill the virus of malignant fevers below Memphis. I fear this, but impress right views on every proper occasion upon the brave men who are hastening to the support of their government. Lose no time while necessary preparations for the great expedition are in progress, in organizing, drilling, and disciplining your 3 months' men, many of whom, it is hoped, will be ultimately found enrolled under the call for 3 years' volunteers. Should an urgent and immediate occasion arise meantime for their services, they will be the more effective. I commend these views to your consideration and shall be happy to hear the result. It may be urged that, considering their disparity of years and experience, this plan of Scott is as crude as was that of McClellan. Such a view is hardly just. The leading suggestions of the General-in-Chief, the deliberate instruction of armies, the choice of a healthy season for active operations, the perfection of the seaboard blockade, and the opening of the Mississippi as the first grand step in the reduction of the revolted states to obedience, were conceptions worthy the fame and achievements of the conqueror of Mexico, and in substance proved prophetic and decisive. The true criticism to be passed upon the plan as a whole is that it was premature and therefore necessarily incomplete. The rebel capital was still in Montgomery, the Confederate military league was not finally cemented, and not till a month afterwards was Jefferson Davis able to announce with confidence his determination to arm 100,000 men. The proper scale upon which to apply military judgment was not developed. There are sufficient reasons why this first outline or military program so soon fell into abeyance and was never formally revived. It remained in the shape of a purpose rather than a defined project. Nevertheless, as a purpose, it had so important and permanent a place in the mind of the General-in-Chief that it gave form and direction to the action of the government. General Scott was not mistaken in his prediction that the impatience of public opinion at the North would prove one of the most troublesome impediments to methodical war. Even while he was writing his prophetic words, a conference of several of the Northwestern governors was in session at Cleveland, Ohio, discussing the state of the country and demanding action, prompt, irresistible, overwhelming. Imbued with the ardor of politicians and confident in that almost unparalleled business energy of the people in which their locality has shown such preeminence, they assumed too hastily that methods of peace might be applied to operations of war. The two processes are radically dissimilar. The achievements of peace, exploration, settlement, tilling fields, and building cities, find their appropriate symbol in the beehive: diffuse labor, continuous activity, cumulative construction, while the courses of war are the movements of the serpent: concentrated force, intermittent action, concealed approach, the preparatory coil, and the spring of lightning-like rapidity, every agency working to waste and destruction. In a memorial addressed to the President, the governors urged an immediate call for 300,000 men and the necessity for preparation and drill. We see a necessity now, not only for the safety of the government, but for the safety of the free border states, for immediate action. There is no occasion for the government to delay, because the states themselves are willing to act vigorously and efficiently. I must be permitted to say it because it is a fact. There is a spirit evoked by this rebellion among the liberty-loving people of the country that is driving them to action, and if the government will not permit them to act for it, they will act for themselves. It is better for the government to direct this current than to let it run wild. So far as possible, we have attempted to allay this excess of spirit. But there is a moral element and a reasoning element in this uprising that cannot be met in the ordinary way. There is a conviction of great wrongs to be redressed, and that the government is to be preserved by them. The government must provide an outlet for this feeling, or it will find one for itself. If the government does not at once shoulder this difficulty and direct its current, there will come something more than a war to put down rebellion. It will be a war between border states which will lose sight for the time of the government. The few weeks following only intensified this general desire and impatience. On May 24, the governors of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois united in a letter asking in substance that the campaign should be immediately entered upon by the armed occupation of Kentucky and its leading communications with the South, and that increased forces and extended authority should be given McClellan for this purpose. By his endorsement, submitted to the Secretary of War on May 29, General Scott pointed out that permission had already been given to McClellan to aid Union sentiment in Kentucky, even to the extent of occupying some of their towns, but that as yet many of the wisest and best Union men in Kentucky have strongly intimated that thrusting protection upon their people is likely to do far more harm than good, and probably the danger can be better estimated at home than by friends abroad. To a present southward campaign, the General-in-Chief was decidedly opposed. In discussing the memorial before Governor Yates and several United States senators, it was urged by some of the latter, and I think concurred in by His Excellency, that Memphis ought to be immediately occupied. This would certainly be to begin a campaign without preparation. Let us suppose Memphis to be threatened before the expedition could reach the point of attack, say with 10,000 men. The enemy would certainly interpose at least the double of that number, and if we commence with 20,000, the same thing would occur, when the cries for reinforcements, being constantly repeated, would probably sweep Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, etc., of their respective quotas of volunteers, and leave us nobody from those states for pushing the war to a close at the right season. For the troops about Memphis would not only have lost the opportunity of acquiring tactical instruction during the summer and autumn, but would be so enfeebled by fevers as to be scarcely able to do duty before late in the winter. Since war is not an exact science, it is idle to speculate upon what might have been the eventualities of a close observance and execution of General Scott's plans. It happened that the veteran's advanced age and ill health rendered it necessary that some one besides himself should be entrusted with the execution of his ideas and purposes as a whole, as well as in their multifarious details. We can therefore hardly imagine it to have been possible to put his views to a practical test. Judged merely as a preliminary outline and theory, they seem to have been eminently wise, and there is little doubt that if some young and energetic commander could have looked at the immense problem in his spirit and in the light of his experience, and could have brought his high professional skill to their performance, the war on the side of the Union would have been more systematic, more effective, and of shorter duration. But in the heat of patriotic ardor and popular craving for action, which prevailed at that time, days seemed months and weeks seemed years, and public impatience could not endure the thought of allowing the whole summer to pass by in seeming idleness and waste, before sending the great armies of the Union on what they fondly hoped would be a short march and an easy victory. The suggestions of the General-in-Chief for enveloping the seceded States by a cordon of posts down the Mississippi and a combined coast blockade received merciless criticism and blind condemnation in the newspapers of the country, and his grand outline of strategy was caricatured as Scott's Anaconda. End of chapter 17.